And also today, we are happy to have Steph Lee, who is a patient living with Cryo. Prior to being diagnosed, Steph Lee was one of the only Minnesotans who did not complain about the winter, but took the day off to celebrate the first big snowfall every year. She's an avid cross-country skier and tennis player, and she loved being outside and being active whenever the season. She grew up and worked in the travel industry most of her life. So in 2012, she branched off on her own and started her own company in the travel space, Host Agency Reviews. Then in 2014, at the age of 34, she suddenly became severely debilitated with no explanation as to why. In 2019, after 5 long years of debilitating symptoms and being told repeatedly it was psychological by neurologists, Steph was diagnosed with cryoglobulinemia, vasculitis. Her illness was a turning point in her life that slowed her down and grounded her, both literally and figuratively. She's now an avid gardener, meditator, and has picked up swimming as her exercise of choice when she's able. She works on her site with a team of 3 other talented ladies and is very thankful she decided to start her own company for the flexibility that it gives her. Steph and her loving partner and caretaker, Paul, live in Minneapolis during the summers and now move to warmer places during the winters, and always with their 2 adorable dogs, Fennec and Orion, in tow. So we should start with Steph. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey with Cryo?
Certainly. So definitely a journey. Like we said in the intro, I was a really, really active person. And around when I was like 33 years old, I started getting some symptoms I just thought was about getting older. I used to be a really great sleeper. Like, people used to be like, Steph fell asleep upside down on the couch. Like, I was a great sleeper. And I started noticing I was having a lot more trouble sleeping. And I was having like leg pains at night that were really hard to pin down. And I started fainting randomly, which was, of course, very concerning. But then the doctors had told me like that it was like a common thing for younger people to have this type of fainting where it just sometimes happens. And then, so I didn't think a lot about it. And then it wasn't until later, probably about a year after my symptoms started, I was having a lot of random pains in my body too. I was going to ski practice and I was on a women's team, and we were starting, it was in the fall, but we were getting ready for the winter season. And I was just so incredibly fatigued, which is not like me. And I like pulled up into the parking lot and saw my ski team like getting ready to exercise. And I pulled myself out of bed to get there. And I was like, I just can't go to practice today, which has never happened in my like 33 years. I was like, so I turned around and went back home. And then shortly after I started, like, my legs both went numb at the same time. And they just were like really tingling. And I went to the doctor and they couldn't find anything. And they also told me that's not really how neuropathy presents, which at this time I'd never really been in the medical system. So I had no idea what any of that meant. But yeah, then it got worse. And then I started, they told me if it starts moving up into your face or like a side of your body to let us know. And then it did start moving up into my face. I think it was my right side of my face. And the nurses told me to call an ambulance, which freaked me out. And so they came into my house, and I failed I just very distinctly remember they told me to put both arms up and close my eyes. And I closed my eyes, and then I opened them, and my right arm had dropped, and I had no idea that it had dropped, and it freaked me out. And then they were like, we're going to just take you to the hospital. It's not a big deal. And so I went in the ambulance, and in the ambulance, they had me like stick out my tongue, and something must have happened with that. I don't know exactly, but they're like, we're just going to turn on the lights. It's not a big deal. And I was crying hysterically at this point because I was really scared. And I got to the hospital, and it was really cool because now that I've been in the system a long time, I know this is not normal, but having not been in the system and watched a lot of TV, I thought this was how you got into the ER a lot. So it was like, they opened up the ambulance doors and all these doctors came out of me, and they're like taking things off of me and like putting things on me. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But then they were like, there's nothing wrong. You didn't have a stroke. Like, you're just fine. And I was like, that was super weird. And it just got worse from there. And I was really debilitated for, I would say, like 6 months. I'd gone to a couple neurologists because a lot of my symptoms seemed neurological. I was having a lot of sensory issues and weakness. I was having trouble with a really hard time with my memory, like couldn't remember my partner's name sometimes. And not just your normal can't remember, but really couldn't remember my partner's name. And so I was told by multiple neurologists that I needed to see a psychologist, which was, of course, it was one of the most traumatic events that has happened during my journey, is being told this is in my head by doctors. But then I finally saw a rheumatologist, because it's really tough to get in as a new patient. And so about 9 months after my symptoms started, and I had been in bed pretty much for 9 months, I was very weak, had a lot of trouble walking on my own. And some days my legs wouldn't work or my arms wouldn't work. I would have trouble lifting up a spoon. It would really fatigue me. It felt like, when I was doing my 40-kilometer ski races and I was going up a hill, like the burning in my arm was so similar to lifting like a spoon to lift my cereal. So they tried me on Prednisone, and I was like back to myself within like 3 days. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. And so then they started me on immunosuppressants. They didn't know what was wrong with me, but they started me on things like Plaquenil, and then added azathioprine. And then my rheumatologist at the time did something a little bit, as my symptoms kept coming back, despite the immunosuppressants. She added on Cellcept to that, which I guess is pretty unusual. And when a couple years in, I started having a lot of trouble breathing. One of my symptoms is shortness of breath. But this was very different. Like, I was not able to stand up on my own, and I had trouble talking because I was out of breath even when I was in bed, and went to the doctors, and they really couldn't find anything. All they could find was that my heartbeat went like crazy up when I started walking, and I became like really short of breath, and I would become really dizzy. And so they eventually found like some ground glass opacities in my lungs was the only thing that they found. But it was a small patch, and it eventually, they never treated me for it. They tried some higher dose prednisone, maybe like 30 or 40 milligrams, but it didn't really make me any better. So I just sat. It was like a rough 3 months for me. It was really, really rough. So that I made it through that flare, but then they told me they wanted to start me on Rituxan, which I'd read you go to their website, and like the first thing it says is this can cause this really rare disease, PML, and it sounds awful. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure how I feel about this. So I went for a second opinion to the Mayo Clinic, this is, by the way, very fun that all of us are familiar with Minnesota on here, because Minneapolis is super close to the Rochester. So cryoglobulinemia is very popular here, I guess. But anyhow, so we went down to the Mayo Clinic, and they told me, you're on way too many immunosuppressants. Because one of the really weird things about my cases is not only is cryo really rare, but my type of cryo, which is the essential cryo, is really rare. And I never had high markers. Like, a lot of people will have inflammation markers that show, and none of mine were ever, even during the worst flares, were ever positive. So it was really difficult to nail me down. So at the Mayo, they suggested I go off my immunosuppressants, and that I didn't actually need to be on those. So I went off of them. And then about the time they wore off, like 6 months later, I started having really bad symptoms again. I started fainting. And this time, though, something really, I was playing, this is very unfortunate, but I was playing tennis for my first time in like 5 or 6 years. And I was super excited with my old tennis partner. And then that night, my feet both got really swollen, which had never happened before, like super swollen, couldn't walk on them, but it wasn't painful. So I just thought maybe somehow I overdid it that day, but they went on like that for a month and a half. And the doctor finally, my rheumatologist said, like, this isn't normal. I think you need to go to the hospital. And I wasn't in pain. So I went to the hospital, and They admitted me to try to figure out what's going on. And the doctors in there said, the rheumatologist team came in and they said, I think we've been looking for horses, and I think it's time we start looking for zebras in your case. So they did tons and tons of testing. Finally, one of my markers was high. I think it was like my rheumatoid factor for the first time ever. And then it wasn't like, it's really interesting that what actually like broke my case open was I had been up in northern Minnesota prior to being admitted, and there was like bugs out, like mosquitoes. So I thought that I had some mosquito bites on my foot because there are these really tiny pinpricks on my foot. And they said, like, is there anything abnormal that's happened? I said, oh no, there's just these couple pinpricks. And then they said, like, we'd like to take a biopsy of them. And they took it. And it was on a part, I lost feeling in my feet and couldn't feel them. So it wasn't a big deal. I was like, go for it. And they came back and they were like, you have leukocytoclastic vasculitis. And I was like, okay. And then they tested me for all the vasculitis, the types of vasculitis, like the ANCA vasculitis, and nothing came back. So they were like, we're just going to put you on high dose prednisone and see if this goes down. They were a little worried because of the like not being able to feel my feet. And the neurology team in the hospital, though, is I think there's honestly like a label on my patient form or something for neurologists. They're like, this woman's crazy, don't deal with her. But they didn't really want to deal with me. And so they didn't want to do the testing, and they didn't want to do the EMG where they test if your nerves are working in the hospital. So I went home, and then they ended up doing an EMG, but it was like 2 months out. And they found out that I had like motor and sensory problems with my nerves, and some of my nerves weren't working in my foot. So then they called and they're like, this is a pretty big deal. We're going to put you on higher dose prednisone, like at 80 milligrams. And we also want to do a nerve biopsy to see if this is in your nervous system, if it's vasculitis. And so they put a special neurologist on my case that I guess specializes in autoimmune diseases and more unusual cases. And he said he'd gone through my whole file, which is a huge feat. And he was like, I noticed there was one type of vasculitis they didn't check you for, and it's cryo. He's like, so I'm going to run this test. And they ran it, and it came back positive. And he was like, there's a lot of false positives, which isn't, I don't think actually what happens, but he's like, there's a lot of false positives. And so we're just going to run it again. I don't think you actually have it. And then he ran it again and it came back positive. He's like, you actually have cryo. So that's kind of been the journey. There's been a lot of heartache, many, many tears along the way. It's been a very difficult journey, but now they started me on Rituxan, and that seems to have kept the disease better under control. I still struggle a lot, but my bad days aren't as often, and my pain levels are down quite a bit, and my flares don't seem to be as serious. So I definitely feel like my quality of life has improved the last year and a half. And that's kind of, my 6 or 7 year odyssey wrapped up into like 10 minutes.
Steph, thanks for sharing that. So Steph, I want to ask you, first of all, as a patient with vasculitis and all the changes that happened in my life, I now feel like they're not near as many as what happened in your life. So I wanted to ask you, how are you handling things? And have you had to modify things in your life to, now that you know what you have and know, how do you move forward? What are you doing differently?
Yes. I would say, it's a journey. Like I've been on this for, I don't know, 6, 7 years. So even in the beginning, I had a real breakthrough. I think along the way, you kind of find things that work for you and make your life a little bit more comfortable. So, I mean, one of the things that you have to adjust is your mental attitude. And that was big for me when I finally realized that medicine doesn't always fix everything. I didn't really understand chronic illnesses before this. And so understanding and kind of accepting that I may not have my old life back was a really big thing for me. And meditation was a big help for me. let's see, John Kabat-Zinn has um, a meditation. He has meditation books and programs that kind of deal with chronic pain that really spoke to me. And I was like, oh, I'm not alone. Like this is, because I felt very alone being a young person and everyone else was out doing their thing and I was stuck at home. But physically, there's a lot of things too along the ways that I've had to adjust to. So I have a lot of joint pain, and my joints don't, I have a lot of muscle weakness. And so I have, like I said, some days I can't walk very well or I can't breathe very well. So I have a walker I use sometimes. And when it was in my lungs and I was having really a lot of trouble, my family bought me a power wheelchair because I hadn't been able to leave the house for weeks and weeks, or at least a month. And that at least allowed me to have some freedom and go off on my own. So those are some of the things. There's other small things too, like on my water bottle, I have, the rubber things they tie your arm up with when you give blood. I'll ask them, like, can I keep that? Because I use them to wrap around things as like a grip, because my grip's a lot weaker than it used to be, and it's a lot harder for me. I have like arthritis gloves and compression things. I take baths every night. And one of the things with cryo that isn't publicized a lot is you need to stay warm. And I'm not as sensitive as other patients that are out there, but like I have bought a lot of heated clothing to help keep myself warm during the winter and in the summer. Honestly, like it's like 100-degree day outside and I don't have the air conditioning on here and I'm wearing like a heated sweater. I just get cold really easily. So there's a lot of things to think about, and like trying to winter in warmer places doesn't solve everything, but we're going to see if that helps with things. So there's a lot of adjustments I've had to make in my life and making sure I get enough rest and cutting down on my stress.
Well, it's great to hear all those things that will help other cryo patients. They will also know they're not alone. And some of these things that you've chosen are great ideas to help them understand how to deal with it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also a great cryo Facebook group if anyone's interested. I think if you just search like cryoglobulinemia in the Facebook groups, you can find them. But that's, where I'm not super active within there, but it's just nice to like hear from other people, to know that in that group of 450, there's 450 of us in the world. So
that is another great piece of advice. That's good to know. Also, I think it's probably a big life decision for some people once they have cryo, making decisions about where they live. I know you have always loved Minnesota and you did love a cold weather day, but things may be different for you now. So are you making big life choices about those things too?
definitely. I was in, I think, a little bit of a denial for my first year and a half or so of my diagnosis. I'm still relatively newly diagnosed. But when I learned that the cold affects cryo patients and can cause flares and different things like that. I distinctly remember writing in the Facebook group, is it possible like that I have cryo, but I'm not affected by the cold? Does anyone else have this? And it's just like radio silence. And what I discovered is, as I kind of look back, I'm like, I'm not as severe as a lot of other people, but I'm definitely affected by the cold. And so Paul and I talked about moving to somewhere warmer during the winters, because the Minnesota winters are, as you can imagine, they can be pretty brutal. And I like, part of what went into making our decision is my network of support is here. My family and most of my friends are here. And how much that weighs out versus like being in a warmer climate, but not having as much support and knowing people. Although, as you can guess, I'm pretty friendly. So that's not really a huge factor for me. But, so we looked at, I was Googling, where are the warmest places to live within the United States and kind of narrowing things down. There's also things to consider, like cost of living. It's not cheap to have, a house here and then be renting a place. So we're really fortunate that we're able to do that. But it's one thing I've learned too, is it's not just like temperatures outside is, even people that have cryo that live in Hawaii or in Florida or in Tucson, they still struggle with the same issues because there's, we've all been into like warm places where you go in and they like have the air conditioning blasting and are trying to make it like it's Minnesota winter. And so that's like the same issue for them. They get really cold and they can flare from, freezing like that. So one of the things that I think a lot of cryo patients do is you're always bringing like extra clothing with you and making sure you're dressed warm if you're going to someone's house. My brother keeps his house super, super cold. So we always bring like my heated socks and my slippers, and make sure I wear extra layers when I'm there and my heated clothing. So thinking ahead about things like that. I don't think there's any way we can 100%. I think even if we stayed in a bubble where we were like at 98.6 degrees, I'm sure it would help, but I don't think there's any way to completely cut the symptoms or anything along those lines.
That's interesting. So you're saying that you guys, as cryo patients, you need to stay bundled up to stay warm?
Yeah, it can definitely cause flares. Like I'm not as sensitive as a lot of people. So I'm in Minnesota and I grew up, like I was a cross country skier. I loved winter. I loved winter, like only person in Minnesota that loves it. And like I was in denial for like the first year and a half of my diagnosis. I was like, I don't think I'm affected by cold. But then I was paying attention and I was like, I definitely am affected by cold. Like I do a lot worse in the winters. And it's even like when I'm out gardening or something in the summer. And if I start to get cold, like when the sun goes down and my sweat starts evaporating, like yeah. I become like the Tin Man and it becomes really hard to move. But other people are like, they can't even drink cold drinks or, they like, I know I'm really sensitive to cold and have trouble with things, but I feel like I'm one of the luckier ones that are out there. Yeah. I mean, I've seen people, that are like, I mean, I wear heated clothing, but not all the time, but like, this is actually heated. See, watch.
Oh, my husband loves those. Oh my God.
Well, this is a brand I really like, Aurora. But being in Minnesota, like in the winters, I just like wear heated clothing. I have heated socks and heated pants and yeah, because I love being outside in the winter. And that's like a way I can do it, I think at least, without too many ramifications. But we are going to try to snowbird this winter in Arizona to see if that can help make it so I don't have as bad of flares. We'll see.
Interesting.
Extra layers when I go places. I get cold really easily and I always kind of have. And I don't know if that's a cryo thing or not, but I mean, even when I know people with Raynaud's have issues too with like circulation in their extremities. But if I grab like a cold glass of water or something and my hands touch it, or if I wash my hands in cold water and I'm kind of chilly for some reason, my hands turn ice cold and I can't warm them up until like all it is like washing my hands or like holding a cold glass of water and my hands like turn super cold, or my feet, like I'm wearing wool socks right now. It's like 100 degrees out. But like I start getting like rashes on my feet when they get too cold. And they're not like the Raynaud's rashes. They're like the cryo rash. Really? So it's really weird. That's new. That's something that just started this year, is the rash, like this particular rash on my feet.